This is Dune Talk, a DuneNewsNet.com production. Join us now for the latest Dune news, reactions, and lively discussions.
Hey everyone, welcome to the new episode of Dune Talk, the official show of DuneNewsNet.com. If you love Dune, this is the place to be. Since Dune came out in 2021, the movie's version of Chani, as portrayed by Zendaya, has been a hot topic of discussion online. Today we'll be addressing some questions relating to her character, plus a couple of movie and gaming news updates. This is Marcus Gabriel, your editor at DuneNewsNet.com. And before the others sign in, I wanted to take this opportunity to shout out all our new subscribers and also thank you for helping us pass 1,000 on YouTube. Whether you're watching there on YouTube or listening on your favorite podcast app, our team really appreciates you.
Hey, this is Garin. It's good to be back. Really do appreciate all the support, and it's a milestone for us to pass the 1,000 mark on YouTube. So thank you for all your support. And I'm really excited to talk about this question that came from one of our viewers, which is a really interesting topic, and I'm excited to talk to the guys about it.
Hey everyone, Johnny Sobchak here again. Excited to get the latest episode up. It's been a little while since we've been together, and yes, the topic this week is an exciting one, and one I'm very curious to hear, especially from Garin and Marcus, who are a little bit more of the textual experts, kind of hearing their input. And thank you for joining us. And as Marcus said, yes, thank you all for the continued support and hitting the milestones and getting more and more excited as hopefully, fingers crossed, part 2 is not too far away by this point.
Cool. Let's start with a quick movie news story.
Dune movie news.
So with the actors union strike still ongoing, it's been as quiet as the deep desert. No interviews or any form of social media updates from the movie's stars. Fortunately, some things were recorded before the strike started, and the This Is Purdue podcast published their interview with Stephen McKinley Henderson. His character, Feyd-Rautha, didn't make any appearance in the last 2 trailers, so it's good to see a bit of him talking about the movie. The actor praised Dune Part 2's great international cast and filmmaker Denis Villeneuve, and he said that fans should get ready for a fabulous, fabulous journey. His highlight, though, of the second movie was working with Austin Butler. Here's one of Henderson's comments from the interview. "And Austin was so nice to me, because I had a medical emergency during the shooting and I had to go away. And when I came back, he played a character that was not very happy with me at all. And he was quite chilling. And I was giving him back the looks. But when they say cut, he would come over to me and say, 'Mr. Henderson, are you okay? Can I help you? Can I get you anything?' Johnny, in the previous episodes, you speculated on whether Feyd will have multiple personas in the film. It certainly sounds like that's something that Butler is strong at. What do you make of this interaction between the two actors?
Yeah, so it's a fun story, and I always love hearing the behind the scenes interactions. And I think that Stephen McKinley Henderson in particular, he's a very, he's a veteran actor, of course, and one of kind of the elder statesmen in the cast. And I also got to recognize, or I'll do kind of a little shout out, because he's a University of North Carolina School of the Arts alum. That's my girlfriend Reagan. That's her alma mater. She's a drama major there as well. And go Pickles. But Stephen McKinley Henderson, I think he's very, very likable, and I haven't seen him in that many projects, frankly. But he's been around for years, and I think he's seen a lot of different actors, and he's obviously come up kind of through the system. And I think, so far everything that we've heard, and kind of just even from Elvis, last year, and through, the promotional tour and Tom Hanks interviews and Baz Luhrmann and Denis Villeneuve, Chalamet, all those different people that have kind of been around Austin Butler and been working with them. I think it's always kind of a similar energy that you kind of sense in their interactions. And he seems just, obviously we can never really know what he's like, but he just seems very, down to earth and pretty, likable. And I think that this story just kind of, again, furthers that. And it's funnier in this story because, of course, we have the contrast between Feyd-Rautha, who's supposed to be this, absolutely detestable maniac, and then you have Austin Butler, who between takes is, he's clearly not the method actor in this. He's just kind of breaking character and talking to Stephen. So I thought this was a really fun story. And that's one of the benefits. It's one of the nice things about promotional tours and actors getting to participate in that, is not just the promotion, obviously, to help the film, but also the great stories and anecdotes and and moments that you get to hear about that never really get to maybe capture otherwise. So fingers crossed again, as you were saying, hopefully we get more of these kind of stories. And Stephen McKinley Henderson, I think the other great thing about this story is that it gives us a little bit more insight to, through fear having a, maybe a bigger role than maybe in part one, and at least being present in some key scenes and maybe some certain subplots and things like that book readers will be familiar with. So that's also promising.
Yeah, and I'd assume he's talking about the scene maybe before or after the arena scene. So after he realized that Two-Fear, was not giving him all the information, and then afterwards he's going to Two-Fear, what was that? What was going on? I can imagine that's that scene afterwards. So next, let's dive into our special discussion topic for today.
The LANDSRAAD High Council is now in session.
We know that Chani will be one of the main characters in Dune Part 2. And this brings up interesting questions of how Villeneuve wrote her role for the adaptation. On our trailer to reaction episode, at Samuel Proudlove 3774 commented on YouTube, would be interesting to hear your guys' thoughts on Chani seemingly not being on board with Paul's mission. There are several moments in the trailer where it seems like she does not support him and is looking at him like he is a monster. I'm very concerned about this, considering nothing like this is mentioned in the book, as far as I can remember. So that got me thinking about how so much of the footage and lines from Chani, both in the first movie, although she wasn't in there like a whole much, but and also in Part 2's trailers, this is largely original to the movie. Whether it's that first scene in the first movie where she's leading the Fremen in battle and giving the narration, or in the latest trailer too, with her stating almost defensively, "I won't be fighting for him. I'm fighting for my people." Garin, as a longtime book reader, how do you feel so far about how Villeneuve is expanding the character? Are you concerned by anything you've seen or heard in the trailer?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm concerned yet. As I've said many times before, I do have a lot of faith in Villeneuve and his creative sensibilities, but I did go back and do a little bit of homework, and I watched the scene at the end of Part 1 where Jessica and Paul are captured. And I remember the first time in the theater, and at the first viewing of that film, when Chani just immediately says, "You're not the Mahdi." She just says it straight out, and I remember something in me, because I've read the book enough times, something went, "Hey, that's a little different," But of course, I was just totally enraptured with the whole thing. And then to now see in both these trailers for Part 2, this emphasis on her doubting and kind of going through and expressing her uncertainty about who Paul really is. So when I was going back and watching those two trailers, and then seeing the emphasis that they chose to include in those trailers of Chani, I think 3 or 4 times, emphasizing that, I don't know if I believe in you. I don't, and even Paul says to Chani, do you believe in me? And so I did go back and search through the original novel, and I don't know that I found every reference or every time Chani says something to Paul, but I didn't find anything that kind of lends itself to that being the case, or that was Frank Herbert's original idea with Chani doubting. Maybe there's some insinuation there that I missed, but I'm not concerned, and I'd like to hear from the two of you before I sort of give you my thoughts on why I think this actually might work better for the audience.
I'll go ahead and break up the two experts here and give my own interpretation. I haven't read the book recently. I haven't combed the texts as of late, but I think from the couple readings that I have done of the novel in the last few years, and also, of course, the many times I've seen the first film and what I've seen in the trailers probably a dozen times each, is that there is definitely, I think, a difference between the Chani of the novel and the Chani that we're getting in the movie, or movies in this case. I do think that Villeneuve, I think he is, yes, as Garin said, I certainly trust his sensibilities and his creative kind of license, I guess you could say. Not everything is, a Slavish recreation of what's in the actual novel. He does take some different liberties and make some changes, for different reasons. I do think that one of the things that, you know, that he's kind of indicated in his interviews going back to part one and maybe more recently since part one came out and in production of part two, is that basically kind of as Jessica was the protagonist in part one, Chani's role is going to be more to the front in part two. And I think an element of that, I think that you almost have to change from, you know, what I recall of the book versus what we're seeing in the movie is, I think, and this is something you could say is a criticism of Dune as the novel or as the character of Chani, is that she kind of has, it's almost like a literal, like manic pixie dream girl situation happening where, you know, she's literally in this boy's visions, and then she comes forward and she's basically in love with him kind of right off the bat, and she's taken by him, and it's this partnership, and it's not like coercive or there's not anything like a sinister like undertone to it necessarily, but it's just kind of there, and like you don't question the relationship, but there's just this natural, I guess you could say, chemistry between them, where I think Villeneuve, you know, whether you agree with this or not, and maybe whether this is accurate or not, but my thinking is that perhaps he's trying to add more of an internal conflict to Chani, which is going to become an external conflict potentially to some degree between her and, whether it's her and Paul to some extent, maybe her and Jessica. I just think that Chani isn't going to just kind of fall in line and like come to the wayside and be like, okay, like I guess Paul's going to take over now and we're just going to go ahead and do everything like they said. It seems like she's going to be a little bit more combative in terms of him coming into this position of power, and Jessica being involved with that transition, you know, to some degree. Obviously, we see in the trailer, and the edit is hard to tell. It's always kind of tricky, but it seems like Chani's, you know, calling into question the this myth or this prophecy. And Jessica says to Paul, you know, we try to give them hope, and Paul says that's not hope. And so it's almost like there's this it's like a triangle almost between Chani and Jessica and Paul. And you could even, I would say or predict that maybe Stilgar is going to be involved in that kind of conflict to some degree as well. With, you know, who's actually in control, where is the prophecy, where is this message coming from, how are the Fremen supposed to react or interpret it? Stilgar's probably going to interpret it and then react one way, Chani another, and the way Jessica has to, you know, navigate the situation versus how Paul is going to be maybe more conflicted and navigate the situation. So I think it's a way to, whatever is going to end up happening with Chani as a character, I think is a way to maybe add a little bit more texture, or I guess you could say depth, for lack of a better term, to the characterizations and also the conflict, and I guess how the Fremen have a role in this changing of control that they're going to experience. I think if you went about it and just had her be kind of like, you know, a doe in the wood kind of response to it, it'd be a little, I think you'd probably get more criticism of that nowadays, of course, in a film like this than you would with a novel from 1965. But whether that's actually the case remains to be seen, but that's my inclination, just with what we have so far, which again could be a little misleading, may not have the full picture, but that's what I think is probably where this is heading.
Yeah, I think that there are two things to that, and like one is what Villeneuve has mentioned. I think you were referring to that, Johnny. Like he said in multiple interviews that, you know, like Chani is one of the main characters. Of course, not the main character. I remember there was a whole misunderstanding about that, like when that interview first came out because of the language. But yeah, she's a very important character in the movie. And he talked about how Zendaya is an actor who really deeply inspires him, and that he increased her role even in the first movie. Like we didn't see a whole lot of her in the first movie, but even that apparently, like he decided to put more of her than initially planned. Like if you look in the book, like Chani is there in some important scenes, but there's not a huge amount of material, right? Like especially when they first meet Paul. You know, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of the introduction. We see a lot of her. Then we see her again in the sandworm riding scene, and then we see her more towards the water of life scene. But other than that, like we don't get to see much of her, like, and especially we don't get to see her perspective a lot. So I think the fact that if she's going to be a main character in the film, then you do have to expand her role in some way. But then going to the point about is her character changing, or like does she doubt in the prophecy, like going back to the original comment. So yeah, I also did some going back to the book, and Chani indeed has no lines or thoughts in the book indicating that she doesn't believe Paul's a prophet. Like there just isn't anything, at least in the first book. There is one pertinent line though. It's not something that she says, but it's very near the end. And like, if you don't want spoilers for the end of the first book, then maybe skip ahead like 30 seconds. But like when Paul talks about how they would threaten the guild by destroying the spice, so using the change water of life to go to the spice blows and start a chain reaction and destroy the worm cycle and everything, Chani is described as putting a hand to her mouth, shocked to numb silence by the blasphemy pouring from Paul's lips. That's really the only indication in the first book that we get that she might be, you know, concerned with some aspect of the prophecy. Other than that, it's like you were saying, Johnny. She's right on board from the beginning. So it does seem like that there are some differences there. With that in mind, Garin, would you say that what we've seen of her in the movie, it feels that she's a different character from the book? Would you agree with that?
No, I don't feel like she's a different character. I feel like she's Chani. I relate to her the same way I always have, by being a fan of the book. I don't want to take anything away from the respect that I have for Villeneuve by saying this, but I remember many years ago learning that Peter Jackson was going to emphasize the Aragorn and Arwen storyline in Lord of the Rings. And similar to Dune, I had also read Lord of the Rings many times as a teenager, and I remember hearing that and being really worried about that, being almost doubting the whole project at that point, because the Fellowship of the Ring had not come out yet. And watching how that introduced an element to the story that actually became very satisfying as a moviegoer and a fan of that trilogy. And so I wonder sometimes, and I'm not a filmmaker, but I wonder if sometimes there are things that need to be emphasized to complete a visual storyline. Because I've heard many times that a book is a very different experience. It may be the exact same story, just as we're experiencing with Dune, but it's an adaptation, and it's a vision, and it's a different experience. And so I don't believe she's a different character. I just believe what Villeneuve is doing is adding a dimension to her that creates a really interesting perspective for us as the audience. Because we were told, and sometimes I have to look at the part one from the perspective of someone who's never seen it before, or rather someone who's never read the book before. And when you're watching that film, immediately when they first land on Arrakis, when the Atreides land on Arrakis, and Jessica and Paul are in the ornithopter, they're going to Arrakeen, and she explains to him that this is a myth. This was planted by the Bene Gesserit, right? And Paul is disturbed by that. He's irritated by that. And so I know that the first time watcher of the film might not miss that, because it's a very layered film, right? There's a lot going on. But immediately the audience is introduced to the fact that this storyline, or this myth that has been planted, is a form of manipulation, right? So we as the audience know this, and then with subsequent viewings of part one, you're reminded of that fact. So in part two, we have this really interesting dynamic going on between what appears to be Stilgar, who is a believer, right? So that brief clip where Stilgar says something to the effect of, I believe in him, like this. And so in a situation like that, you are going to have some of those people that were born under this myth. They were raised with this. And now they're seeing these indicators of Paul and Jessica and all the signs that this myth is real. But in fact, we know as the audience that it's not entirely real. It was planted. It was contrived. And so I just think it adds a new layer of dimension between the Paul and Chani relationship to have her seeing him as a vulnerable human, not as a prophet or a god, and to have that be a part of their relationship, because there's going to be more emphasis not only on Chani and her character, but also on her relationship with Paul. So I try to not think of it kind of like what you were alluding to, Johnny, that in this day and age, we have very strong women heroes and characters, and I hope this wasn't just a tip of the hat to that pattern. I hope that this was done in a way that could create a really interesting dynamic and help to emphasize the relationship of Paul and Chani, but also to help us also see through the eyes of those who would be skeptical and kind of see this as not being entirely all that it appears to be, that Paul is the prophet and he is the prophecy, he is the Huizat's Haderach, So I like that. I think it's balanced, and so I'm really supportive of it.
I think, Garin, I'm really glad. I think you have really good insights there, and I think that particularly you kind of touch on something that I was also thinking earlier today when I was thinking about what I was going to say in this episode, and that was that ultimately it's important that Chani has certain characteristics that are accurate to what's in the book or what makes Chani Chani. So she's strong, she's a capable warrior, she's one of kind of the leading Fremen figures, and then that's her own character. Now, how that character is in relation to other characters is something else. So how she is, as a companion or a partner to Paul, for example, that is important. But what I guess I'm getting at is that it's important that she still loves Paul and that she has some sort of support for Paul ultimately. However, she doesn't need to be just along for the ride. She doesn't just need to kind of not have any sort of mixed emotions or anything like that. I think what's happening that, again, and this isn't a fault to the book. Again, this is just something I think in terms of adaptation and moving something from text to film and doing the adaptation process is, how do you make things, I guess, more palatable, and when you're breaking it up and kind of making key character moments and having everything make sense. I think having Chani have more of an internal conflict, I think, makes the story, frankly, it makes it a lot more tragic, because instead of someone who's just along for the ride and is kind of again, just almost not mindlessly, but is just so dedicated and overwhelmingly kind of in service of Paul, basically, as this new kind of Messiah figure, essentially. Having her have this conflict of, well, I do love Paul and I do want to help him and I want to work with him to save the Fremen and take down the Empire and all these different things. Like, I think that is important, but it's almost more interesting and more tragic that it's all in the same breath. It sounds like, at least based on the trailers, that she recognizes that this prophecy is going to cause the downfall of the Fremen, almost like Paul realizes. Now, Paul has his prescience, which allows him to kind of see this outcome, but it's almost like, because, and again, this is kind of more speculation because we haven't seen the movie yet, but like Chani being so close to Paul and knowing the prophecy and knowing, kind of maybe having almost some idea of what Paul is seeing, realizes that it's going to be ultimately to the detriment of the Fremen, even if they're able to get out from under the boot of the Emperor and the Harkonnens and these different oppressive forces. I think that it's just going to be a very and I think Zendaya, from what I've seen of her performance so far in the trailers, I think she is doing a good job of portraying someone who is like having these mixed feelings. And she, obviously, you can tell like she's very much in love with Paul, which we're going to see that relationship kind of really develop in this movie. But you also see her like angry and like having like almost like confusion on her face in some instances. So, and also we have to acknowledge, and I don't know how much we're getting into spoilers, but she's going to go through some very traumatic incidents in this film, which could push her over the edge, even in a situation where she recognizes where things could ultimately go in the grander scheme. for her own personal reasons, for her own, again, similar to Paul, she chooses to kind of go down this path anyway. She knows who Paul is and who he could become, but she's going to be with him and love him and support him anyway. And again, I think that just, it adds a little bit more, I think, richness in terms of that relationship and overall Chani's place in the story, if we think of it or approach it from that angle or that thinking, which again, speculation, limited knowledge, but I think that's what Villeneuve might be going for, just based off of what we've seen.
Argue that Chani's character does feel different in a way from in the movie compared to the book, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, as you both made some good points there. But like looking at some of the evidence of that, like in the book, before the Jamis fight, Chani gives Paul advice of how to fight with Jamis. So she says, okay, Jamis has a habit of turning to the right after a parry, and he can fight with both hands. So, look out for a knife shift. In the movie, she hands him a Chris knife so that he can die with honor, and talk about how Jamis will give him a quick death, So it definitely is a very different feeling, at least, as a viewer and someone who's read the book so many times. I mean, like, it makes sense in a way, but it is a very different feeling. And then going back to, we've mentioned that, like, in the book, there's no indication that she's not on board with a prophecy. So I think, indeed, I'd say that the movie version of Chani's character does have some significant differences, but I guess the most important question from my perspective, and maybe, we can't really answer that now without having seen the entirety of Dune Part 2, is what is Villeneuve's goals behind those changes? Like, is it to tie in with the themes of Dune? As mentioned, when you're reading the book, there's all this subtext, you're going to people's minds, there's a lot of description, and that makes it very clear that, something's going on here, something's not right with this prophecy, there's something terrible going to happen. And when it comes on screen, you can't really convey that. So having Chani be the way that, like, the viewers can relate to that, like, that totally makes sense. So I hope that that's what he's going for. And likewise, the point about Villeneuve, he has read later books as well, and, like, as mentioned, he hopes to adopt Dune Messiah as well, where Chani is an important character, and there we get to see more of Chani's character. And I do feel like when you look at Messiah, that her character is much more developed there. So he maybe brings some of that perspective already into the first movie.
I think you make a really great point, that you could, like you've said, say that Chani is a different character in the movie and plays a different role. I think what I was trying to express is, it still feels like Chani to me. I still place her in my mind as the role that I remember from the book. But let's be honest, it's a long time since 1965, and so when you do an adaptation, there are things that have to be updated, as it were, or more relatable. Like I don't. This is something I brought up before on the podcast, but in the end scenes of Part 1, when Jessica and Paul are going through the desert alone, I think it's a couple of times as they're getting their gear on and their still suits and their gear, and Paul just turns to Jessica and he says, "Are you good?" And that's not a phrase that you would say in 1965. You would say, "Are you well?" or "Are you okay?" But "Are you good?" is a phrase that, like, everyone says now, right? My kids all say that, "Are you good?" And so I really think it's also, there could be an element of just, making sure that her character plays a more prominent and more influential role in the character development of Paul, and is not a secondary background character. And I think it would have been a big mistake to have kept her as a less prominent, a more stoic, less involved character. I think that would have been a missed opportunity. So I like the fact that she's being emphasized this way. And then, Marcus, the point that you made, and I have read this about the advantage of reading a book is you do, and you do know the character's thoughts. And Frank Herbert especially does that when he writes, because the italicized text is the thoughts of the character. And that is impossible sometimes to depict on screen in a way that doesn't feel really weird. It's like with the original cut of Blade Runner, had the voiceover of Harrison Ford going. That's the way it originally was shown in the theaters, and then later in a subsequent change, Ridley Scott eliminated that because to him he never wanted it in the first place, because he called it a really cheap way of getting into the mind of the character. And so Villeneuve knows that. He's a master of this art form, so he's going to find a way, like you were saying, Marcus, to show us those thoughts. Imagine that, this were a story taking place in 2023 between a man and a woman who are falling in love, and this man is having prescient visions of the future, and people are following him like a prophet. The woman in that relationship is going to be like, "Are you for real? Like, is this real? What are you doing?" That's real. Like that's honest and accurate. And so I think Villeneuve might be kind of trying to inject some of those more relatable, realistic elements into this story, because she's in love with him. But when you're in love with someone, you also show your vulnerabilities, right? And so Chani is going to see some of this, and she's going to be like, "I don't really know if you're what all these people think you are,"
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I feel like all this discussion and theorizing and analysis is just making me so much more excited for the movie, because I think, obviously I think we're all pretty optimistic and have high hopes as to what it's going to end up being. And I think if it's anything kind of like what we're getting at, even if it's different from the novel, or, in nature of adaptation, if it's not exactly what fans are expecting or maybe hoping for, I think it'll still be at least very interesting and offer something different. Because, in terms of updating something or adapting something, I think that throwing in different elements and changing certain characteristics or relationships and dynamics, as long as it's still true to the essence of what the book represents and what the characters represents, I think that that's great, and it gives us something new from the world and from these characters that maybe we wouldn't have thought of before, made connections with before, because we're getting it in a new medium. And I think that this Chani question that one of our viewers raised is just a great example of something, just one thing from this adaptation with this one particular character that I think there could be so many different possibilities, and we still have to see obviously the final product. But it's really exciting. I think, for me personally, as someone who's only read the book a couple of times, haven't read it in multiple years, and frankly more of a movie fan, and I would say a Denis Villeneuve fan than I am maybe a Dune fan on its own. I'll be the first to say that I maybe was not crazy about Chani just as a character in the novel. Like, it was like, oh, Chani's like my favorite character, like one of the most interesting characters to me. It was always Paul and Jessica and Duncan and some of my other favorites. But I think what they're doing with this, and of course seeing it on screen and in flesh and everything, is just so different. And Zendaya, I think is a very talented actor. I think it's just going to give us something, again, different, or at least something for me that I think maybe, as you were saying, Garin, might be a little bit more relatable, or something that I can kind of really latch onto in a way that, and then again, not to knock the book or the character of Chani on the page or anything, because that's its own thing, but just something different and that we can still appreciate and get ultimately what we get in the novel, what the ultimate overall message is, what the themes are, and what the conclusion really of this story in this first novel is. I think that's really just the most important thing. And again, that's where I trust Villeneuve to really stick the landing, no matter what he tinkers with kind of on the way to the conclusion.
We do see more of Chani in Messiah, and there's something that we learn about her also later on in the series, without giving any spoilers. So if Villeneuve is in a way sort of foreshadowing towards those things, and as mentioned, like using this change in her character as it were, like to strengthen the overall themes of the story, then then I think that would make sense. But yeah, we'll have to watch the final movie, and I'm sure there will be some hot discussion when the movie comes out. I'm remembering the part where we see Lady Jessica in the first movie going through the corridor, and you can like see that she's visibly distressed. And I remember a lot of people criticized that because they were saying, Bene Gesserit wouldn't show emotions, but like how else would you show that on screen? I guess those are the considerations that you have to take when you're going across mediums. So I guess I challenge maybe to people to think like maybe the story doesn't necessarily have to be updated. Maybe that's not the right word, but you do have to sort of translate it into a new medium, as it were.
But I just want to shout out to our viewer that gave us this question, because this is an incredibly great question to ask, because this is why I love the Dune franchise so much, because one question about one character and what's it conversations for 45 minutes and I just love that.
Yeah, good discussion, and I'm sure we could probably go on for another 45
a lot longer.
But yeah, I'm sure we'll explore this topic more when the movie does come out and revisit this. For now, let's jump quickly to our last segment.
The DUNEVERSE, books, comics, games, collectibles, and more.
We got a few pieces of gaming news out of Gen Con earlier this month. Gale Force 9 is releasing a third house expansion for the classic Dune board game, Dune, a game of conquest, diplomacy, and betrayal. This expansion adds 2 new factions, House Ecaz and House Moritani. Including the base game and earlier expansions, players now have the choice of 12 different factions to take control of. So in addition to the new factions, this expansion does add multiple new game mechanics. So there's one mechanic called Homeworlds, and that basically allows players to raid homeworlds of other houses and destroy their spice stockpiles. And that and the other features can be added to any game, even if you don't use one of those 2 new factions. So Garin, I know you've been a huge fan of this board game, even long before Gale Force 9 reissued it in 2019. Are you looking forward to expanding your next gaming session?
This game is not for the faint of heart. It's not as complex as the war games of the 1970s, which I was fortunate enough to play with some of my friends' older brothers when I was really young, probably far too young to be playing war games, but it is complex, I guess, like the story, right? It's very layered, feints within feints, plans within plans. But adding another 2 factions with some new adjustments to the rules, I would think this would make it extremely fun to play. So Johnny, I know that you haven't had an opportunity to play this game yet, but when you have a group of, I think the largest group I've played this original Dune game with, which did not include the expansion that that you just introduced us to, Marcus, but I think we had 6, maybe 7 people playing, and wow. It was really exciting because that game has a way of actually creating the same intrigue and political sort of espionage that's in the book. And two or three of the people that were playing with us weren't even board game people. Like they maybe kind of knew a little bit about the Dune story, and I think maybe one of them had seen Lynch's movie, but I just did a really quick basic intro and everybody really got into it. And there was alliances and people were trying to manipulate and fool the other factions. And I was really amazed because before then I had always played it with about 4 people. That was about as many people as I had ever played it with through the years. And so playing with even more, and now you can even add more with this expansion. I just think it's a game that's really going to last through the years because it creates an experience between the players that is pretty hard to create in board games. And if you're a Dune fan, it's even more fun because you understand why that character has that advantage or why that house is weak in that area. You know, to someone who doesn't know the Dune lore, to them it's just okay. So my faction, the Ixians, they have a weakness and a strength here. Okay, I accept that. But to those of us that know the story, it's like, oh, that's cool because I know that faction. I know the history behind that. So I just am really a fan, and I guess my only hesitation might be if you're adding now another expansion with layered additional rules to layer in. It might be a little bit challenging to kind of get used to that, but to real fans of this game, they're gonna figure it out, and it's gonna add an even more rich dimension to the interaction of these players in this game. So
yeah, we'll have to plan a team game at some point.
Yeah, we should, because it would be fun, because we would be able to analyze it. Even you, Johnny, would be able to analyze it from the perspective of, I know what that means, you know?
Yeah, and that's not the only game getting an expansion. So Dire Wolf announced Dune Imperium Uprising, and that's a new standalone expansion to Dune Imperium. And this is tying into Dune Part 2, and we've seen some really nice artwork from there that's inspired by the upcoming movie. Dune Imperium, like in case you haven't played it, it's a tabletop game combining elements of both card deck building and placements on the map. And I know a lot of you in the community who've played the game really enjoyed it. So the cool thing, as mentioned, this is a standalone expansion, so it can be played by itself, and it also now supports up to 6 players. I know that the original version supported up to 4 players, and it can be mixed and matched with the base game or the earlier expansions. So as mentioned, you can put it together in any way you want. You don't have to buy all of them. Garin, I haven't played this game yet. You have played the original Dune Imperium, right? Like, what's, I guess, the big difference between this Dune Imperium and, I guess, the classic Duneborn game?
Well, and I don't know if this is a fair comparison, because I played Dune Imperium probably only about a year ago with just one friend of mine who is a huge board game collector. He literally has over 1,000 board games, if you can believe that. and so he said, I really want to play this with you, Garin, because I know you're a big Dune fan. And I'll be honest, it took me a little bit to catch on to the rules and the gameplay, but as I got into it, I got used to it. And it has an interesting combination of deck building. It's more conceptual and symbolic than the original Dune game that we just got done talking about. It's not as sort of literal with a map of Arrakis or anything like that. It's more sort of conceptual in what kind of battles and placement of the power of your armies, and you do use special abilities, Bene Gesserit special abilities, other factions. But as I got into it, and I think we played it for probably an hour and a half until one of us won. And once I was about 3/4 of the way into it, I was really a fan. Like I was like, I'm really catching on to this, and this is really fast paced. It's turn-based, but it's really fast. It really moves along because you're making a lot of decisions in a pretty short period of time. So adding an expansion, which is really interesting. I'd be curious to see kind of what that does to the gameplay time, and then what kind of aspect that would add to adding more players. Because again, I only played it with one other person, which was very enjoyable, but I really liked the dynamics of many players in a board game.
Yeah, I guess one interesting aspect already from the first version of the game is that you could even play it alone, because there's an app that comes with the game, so you could play it as a solo game session against the AI or the app in a way. So it's quite flexible in what different situations. But in addition to this tabletop version, Dune Imperium is also getting a video game adaptation. So that's going to be the 3rd new Dune video game in the past couple of years. So this will start with content from the base game, and then they're going to be planned to add those additional expansions in the future. And this version will allow for online events, leagues, tournaments. It's available now on Steam for if you want to put it on your wish list. And they said it should be available in Q4. So I guess also around the time that the movie comes out. So I guess, Johnny, one question relevant for you. If you haven't had an opportunity to play your physical copy, does a digital version make it more convenient to try?
For me, not necessarily. As a matter of fact, I'd probably prefer to step away from a screen and do something with cards or a board or dice or whatever the case may be. So I do need to take it upon myself to actually play Dune Imperium. I do have it. I think I have had it for like almost 2 years now, from Christmas 2021. But yeah, I'm looking forward to. I will do it before year's end, at least. So I'm excited, and the games sound like a lot of fun. I think in particular, I even almost prefer with Dune. I think I like the tactile kind of physical board game style, especially when you have multiple players or many players, as Garin was saying. It just adds to the intrigue and like the deception. I think all that's like really fun. So I almost think Dune lends itself more to that, at least in these games we've been talking about. So I'll definitely be on the lookout, and I will play some Dune Imperium here sooner than later.
Great. So that's our show for today. So before we sign off, just want to give a big shout, of course, to Simon. He wasn't joining us for today, but he'll be joining in future episodes. But in addition to being a co-host of the show, he does the editing, a great job all the time. So thanks, Simon, and looking forward to next episode. Yeah, let's go ahead and close.
Thanks, guys. I'll see you soon. Back to the editing room.
Thank you, everyone, once again for watching the show and joining us today. It's Johnny Sobchak here. You can find me on Twitter, Letterboxd, Instagram, all that good stuff at Johnny Sobchak. And I'm thinking just now, how many episodes do we have left between now and when Dune Part 2 comes out? Hopefully it's not more than a handful. That's my wishful thinking, but it's going to be a fun ride. Plenty more to talk about. And we'll have more episodes coming your way soon. So thanks again.
Hey, it's Garin, Garin at Dune Companion on Twitter. I really enjoy going deep into this stuff with the team here, and just really appreciate the interaction and the question again that was asked that we highlighted and talked about today, and just really appreciate all the support of everyone. It really feels good to connect with true Dune fans out there, and we know that's who you are. So thank you.
Yeah, and this is Marcus Gabriel, editor at Dune News Net. You can find me writing at Dune News Net. You can find me on Twitter at Marcus is Writing. And yeah, as Edris mentioned, assuming that the movie does come out in a couple of months, you'll be seeing a whole lot of episodes for us in the coming weeks. So until then, take care.
We hope you've enjoyed Dune Talk. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you know when the next episode drops. Stay tuned to DuneNewsNet.com and add us to your social feeds. Be the first to hear breaking news and reviews.